Okay, just want you to sort of relax and watch that paint. Don't be fiddling with it. There's painting time and there's observation time. We must do the observation bit because that does to, you know, that stops us from just keep playing with the paint, you know, keep pushing the paint around. You've got to stop and find out what it is that what's happening to the paint that you've already delivered, rather than just keep fiddling with it. Because it doesn't, what watercolor doesn't do is give you the end result immediately. It's still morphing as I look at this. Okay. If I chose, there's a timing issue here. If I thought, well, you know, yeah, I'm happy with that. I'm not going to fiddle. I'm not going to pick my brush up. But maybe I could see a little telegraph post and I'll just go in maybe and scrape something out there, something like that. This would be the time to do it. I often miss opportunities like that myself, and I end up probably putting in something against there with white gouache at the very end of the painting. But these are just, you know, everything you do is a sort of an opportunity to do many things, if you like. Here's another thought for you, as there is always so many different ways of painting the same thing. You know what I was saying about painting around your buildings? Well, I always do that, particularly for my main buildings, okay? But what about those buildings we said we didn't want to include, okay? Or if we were to include them, we would only hint upon them. Well, this is what you need to do. You can bring down into this area, let's say this area here, bring down the background a little bit, okay? Always got to remember the edge that you're leaving. So you can bring down that background there. I'm thinking about this edge down the bottom here that I'm creating. So it's not just a case of just filling in a shape. Think about the edges and what they're doing and what they're suggesting. Yeah, so those buildings, rather than have to sort of pop them out too much by painting around them like we have the other shapes, what you do is you put the paint on. This is probably too wet. Let me just speed dry it. Speed dry that area. Speed dry it a little bit, so it takes it to that point where it's not quite wet and it's not quite dry. Now these little shapes over here could indicate something, just something, that property, something like that, okay? And there you've got your answer to, you know, what do you do about those buildings on the right hand side? Don't make too much of them. Okay, that's still very wet, but it is drying out, and I'm going to speed dry the whole thing now, I think. Another way that we could do it, I don't throw too many options, but just so you know, you could not speed dry this and tease some of this same color down into the foreground down here. But I think this is the way I normally work. What you're about to see is the way I'd normally work in this situation. So I'll show you what works for me is best. So here we go. I'm speed drying this. Just got a little pocket there. It probably needs to come up, otherwise it will be pushed around my background. There we are. That's dry enough. It's not, obviously not bone dry. I can still feel the dampness, but it's dry enough to continue working. I've got I don't know whether you can see this. I could probably show you towards the end if I zoom in. I've got a lot of granulation in my paint, and I really like that because it offers that type of texture that you'd expect to find in a woodland that's that far away. So yeah, granulation is good. You can buy granulation fluid that, you know, creates it, but I've never felt the need for it. I think when you're mixing ultramarines with any of the earth colors, you know, the umbers, the siennas, you're nearly always going to get granulation. Right, so let's move our attention to the foreground now. So what I'm doing effectively, I'm making a sandwich area of where I'm staying out of for the moment, okay? But this is where our friend lemon yellow comes into its own. I've got to clean this because it will sully the yellow. If I can find my spray. So I'm just spraying this off so I can clean it easily. There we are. And I'm probably going to continue with the flat brush for this for the moment. And I'll take all of that lemon yellow. And in fact, a lot more is required. Now, you may be thinking, you know, could I use quinacridone gold? You can use any color you want. Ask yourself why you're choosing the color. What does the color do? Is it bright? Is it dull? What's the purpose of that color? You could use quinacridone gold, as quinacridone gold is actually quite an orangey yellow and it's transparent. And providing you didn't put too much on top of it, it will remain brilliant and transparent and bright. So you could, yeah, absolutely. As I say, there's always options. But I'm favoring a sort of opaque look for this foreground. And what I've just done here is I've added a little bit of raw sienna to this, okay, which has warmed that yellow up, but it's still bright. Don't put too much of that in because you will knock the brightness out. Now this is going to look really bright and loud and garish, and it's exactly what I want it to look like for this stage. But of course, it will be too bright, and what you'll see me do then is tame it down with either a bit of ultramarine blue, or I'm having it out ready here, a bit of cobalt blue, and even maybe, as this will need knocking back a little bit once it's on there, maybe even a little bit of alizarin crimson. So let's have a little bit of alizarin crimson out. Not much. So I don't want to sully it down. It'll go very bright, and the danger is that then you just knock the brightness out completely. But start bright and go dull. You can't go dull and then expect to be able to go bright on top of it. So this is that foreground territory. Nice big single brush marks shapes. Seems to teeter out down here like this. You can cut around. Now the other thing is you do need to do this a bit quickly, because if this does dry, there's no harm in going up in front of the buildings a little bit here, because we'll be covering those anyway in a moment. You can go up a little bit, but do cut around quite carefully around your water's edge, because that is important. Cut around that, cut around your little boat for now. In the gaps around the rocks, if there is one, around the rocks like this. And there we've got a really bright sunlit foreground, okay? That just breaks up into the upper areas a little bit. Because, you know, you look at that photo, there are lawns, just shallow little horizontals in places catching the light up there. And to me, that's what it looks like, you know, so that's what I'm going for. That's what I'm applying. Now, so as I say, that it's a touch too bright. Remember, this is watercolor. It's not going to dry off as bright, okay? So what do we do from here on in with this bright area? I think a little bit of extra warmth now. And again, I'll show you what happens when I mix like this. I don't mix this bit of paint into the entire puddle. It gets mixed right at the edge of the puddle. And if I want some of that from the below, I bring it in. Okay, so it's just warmed up that lemon yellow. And I look at the photo and I see, yeah, there's some tonal changes and some temperature changes nearer the water's edge down here, something like this. It's still very wet. I'm working wet into wet here. And it's incredible how that bit of warmth makes the green yellow, which is the lemon yellow, look even brighter. But right at the water's edge, we cool things down. I'm cleaning the brush thoroughly here. Okay, cleaning the brush. I better get rid of this because I don't think it's going to work with my cooling down color, which is going to be the ultramarine blue, or in even cobalt blue if you wish. Makes no difference in this situation. So there's a bit of blue. I'll take a little bit of the alizarin crimson and create a very weak watery purple. Okay, and this is going to go right at the water's edge. Look at my brush. The handle points upwards, and I just place the point of the brush at the very bottom of that yellow shape, wherever it is. It just comes over the top of the rocks and the little boat here. Because of the blue in there, that looks it doesn't look purple. It doesn't look like the color that we've mixed, and that's because there's so much blue in it that it's only ever going to go green. Okay, because you're putting effectively blue on yellow. So it's not surprising that that area goes green. Now, when it's all a bit drier, we can put the same sort of mix as I've just made again there, and it will look increasingly purple because it won't be mixing with the yellow when it's dry. So it makes sense. It's all practical, very, very practical issues. And I think this is a good time again to take a breather. But before we do, I just want you to do one more thing with this brush. Okay, I'm cleaning the brush thoroughly and I'm squeezing all the water out of it. Okay, so I've just cleaned that brush. Whoops, be falling on my painting, all the dribbles. I've cleaned that brush thoroughly and I've squeezed all the water out of it. Okay, you won't get all the water out of it. But look at the photo for a moment and you can see plateaus, planes of even lighter, just thin strips of light. And I'm just drawing those off. And every time I do, I'm back in the water to get rid of that paint that the brush has picked up and doing the same thing, squeezing the water out of it. And I'm just looking to create the highlights at the top of some of those flatlands, those areas where the ground is really flat and facing the sky. It's all about creating form. So that could take a little bit of some areas out here if you feel as though the ground is undulating slightly. But here's the thing, at some point we will want to, I think we should do that actually now, thinking about it. We need to make sure that this ground is tumbling down to the water's edge. So I'll just take a rigger brush. I'll take some raw sienna and ultramarine blue. Okay, that, because this is still damp, and I want us to create a little bit of suggestion of horizontal. Here we go, up the side of the little embankment there, up to here, maybe a line, but there's a fence posts here. Always put a line between your posts. They're looking a little bit too organized, aren't they, to equal there. So let's leave a gap here till we get to about here, this end of the shoreline, and put one of these diagonal lines in down here and a couple close together down here, because of course as things squeeze up like that, those lines, these lines here may be the same distance apart. Sorry, those might be the same distance apart as these that we did, but because they're foreshortened because of the angle, they appear to fall closer to each other on the ground. Okay, I think that's, as I say, a good time to sort of relax and sort of take stock of what we got so far. Don't lose your mix down here if you've still got some like I have, okay, because we'll be using that in a moment to just dry brush that reflected sort of color over the water here. Okay, take a breather, folks, and just, you know, as I'm doing, honestly, as I'm doing now, I'm just considering the next move. Now those posts probably won't scrape out of this yellow because it's too pale. It does actually to a certain degree. If we do put any darker paint anywhere near those posts, which we might, then, as I say, we'd scrape these out. It looks to me now, in the greater design of things, that most of those posts will be painted in a sort of dark brush mark with a dark brush mark. Okay. We're just chilling now, as I say, just sort of making sure that you're feeling relaxed still. I'll just do a little bit of tidying up around the edge of my painting. Sometimes it's worth doing this because if you've been using a lot of water, which we do most of the time for these paintings, you will have a buildup of water at the tape, the edge of the tape, and at some given point, it'll decide that the water wants to come back into your painting, and you think, where did that come from? That little bit of water puddles back into your beautifully painted background or field and spoils it. Or if you're really lucky, it turns into a shrub and looks brilliant. Okay, so I'll tell you what I'm thinking. I know where I'm going to go next because we've already said it. We're going to be picking up some of that yellow and putting some reflected dry brush, horizontal brush marks in the water. Later, to be followed by some darker marks, and when both of those things are dried, that's then some vertical reflection type brush strokes. But that's the plan. See, it's all there. It's all already planned out. We know where we're going there. But what about the other areas? And this is what I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking it's time to put windows in the buildings. And you know why we do that. You know, this has been brought up many times. I put the windows in now because I put them in before any other paints go on top of those shapes, because the windows then, when you do go over them with a wash, they'll soften slightly and they won't look so artificial. They won't look like the windows and doors have been cut out and stuck on. So let's do that. I'm going to speed dry that because there's a danger of me putting my hand on wet paint here. So. I can't remember which month it is, but I'm just starting to pencil in the program for next year, folks. It's one of the early ones. It might be, I don't think it's January, it might be February or March. And by where we put a really loose painting together. I mean, painting really loose, probably a painting much closer to how I paint most of the time. When I'm not painting like this, I'm painting by this other way, and it's really loose. And one of the sessions will be not using a drawing at all. It's just to paint with paint. It's just to put your painting together with paint. The only element of drawing will come from actually paint from a small brush and probably a rigger brush on that occasion. So here is one little brush. I think it's, there we are, a size 4. You'd go up to a size 6 if you want, but try not to go any smaller than a size 4. And I'm just going to push. I really like, and it might seem like a nonsense type thing, but I really like this double window on that building there. So, you know, normally I just put a little notch down, a little sort of lozenge shape. But now and again, it's good to sort of indicate a variation in these things. So there, that's, sorry, you want to know the color of that, don't you? It's ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. And although this isn't meant to be much back there, we will suggest that there's a couple of windows on that little, whatever it is, roof, building, sorry. Wouldn't bother with windows on those things, those shapes we made over here with the scraping out. But, you know, because I'm putting them in there for you to see, they don't really register. Okay, I don't see much point in doing them. You know, there are other occasions when that type of thing actually is the main focal point of the painting, and there isn't any of this more detailed type of buildings, and then things like windows pushed in places, in certain places in those type of situations can work. So what else have we got? We've got something dark under that light that's reflected, haven't we? Must be a shed or something like that, I think. So let me just pick up. This is dry brush mix, remember? Okay, it's so dry, there's so little water in it, paint doesn't actually want to come off the brush too easily. Another window there, even though there's not a window, can't really see a window on that building, but I'm figuring there probably is one. And anyway, and in any case, sorry, it certainly looks better for putting a window there. It would be very bland if it was just a white triangle. Very boring. So where else could we use a bit of dry brush? Strictly speaking, we should go along the lines very carefully with as thin a line as you can possibly get. Just a bit of a dry brush line underneath the underneath the edge of the roof. So that's what I'm doing. And down the sides of the triangle of the roof, of course, maybe under the lintel of the chimney at the top. I know some of this stuff will get lost, there's no doubt about it. But I make little marks because I'm assuming this is a fairly normal place as any neighborhood. There will be things left outside the house. Don't know what they are. The photo doesn't even reveal what they are. It tells you there's something there in places. So that's all you can do. Is actually, this is about the only time when I say you have to paint what you can see, only what you can see, and then if there isn't anything there to see, you've got to make it up. You've got to think, well, it's somebody's garden. There's going to be things standing in the corner. There's going to be, you know, they're just shapes, tiny little shapes, but they do make up the interest. These things that I'm doing now are what provides the interest in your paintings. And if you, the artist, can't tell what those things are that's offering these shapes, I can assure you, your viewer isn't going to question it. They're not going to say, you know, what's that supposed to be? If they do, they're very sad. So they just want to find fault in your artwork, and that's their little world. So so there's now so what I've done here is, sorry, before I go off on a tangent, I sort of, for the moment at least, done with the dry brush. Actually, am I? Shall we just do a couple of shots down near the water's edge for now, probably needing to come back to some of this, just dotting the recesses and edges of my little rocks down here. Okay, any little area at the edge of my shapes down here that I consider to be a nook or a cranny, or the edge of the water. There's the bottom of the boat. That can always do with a nice dark solid line, or I shouldn't say solid, broken somewhere, but a good weighty line that's broken slightly. And the gunnel of that, I'm not going to put a fancy color on that gunnel. You could decide to put the top of this boat in red, cadmium red or something like that, but it's not really about that. I'm just staying off the top of, very top edge of that little gunnel, so that there's light hitting the top of the little boy there. So there's light on the very top of that little boat. Okay, and of course later, don't do anything else on that boat. Don't do anything else at all, because later we can put a little bit of water on the hull of that boat when those two dark lines have dried off a bit. What was I doing? I was just traveling along the water's edge here, wasn't I? So I see a couple of little straggler rocks on the edge of the water down here. This incidentally is Portree on the Isle of Skye, and it's just if you haven't been there, it's just spectacular. It's where I saw my first real otter in real life. So in these little ravines that we've painted down, coming down to the water's edge, the odd dark mark, just in one or two places like this. Can't resist it. Sometimes when those little bits of paint are still wet, you can take a reflection off them with your finger like that. Don't do too many. Don't do it with the boat. Just the odd little mark, but they need to be vertical. Don't go off to the right or to the left, it'll look awful. Okay, mine are not particularly straight, but that was just a bit of fun. We'll get to that bit later. Okay, now let's consider the darker shapes through the hedgerows. Okay, sticking with the same size 4 or size 6 brush, and my mix is still the blue and the raw sienna. Okay. Those darks, incidentally, were the blue and burnt sienna. This is blue and raw sienna, and I'm just mostly using a vertical brush movement here, single movement for each little stretch of hedgerow, like this. And I'll show you another way of doing this in a moment. This is how I just start myself off here. See, this is traveling up like this. Something like that. And I'm thinking about what I'm leaving behind this hedge, these little glimmers of the lawns of these properties back there above. Okay. Let's continue down here. Yeah, I'll show you something in addition to this in a moment. Let me just continue this. I think I'll have a gap here. Let's stop. Let's have a gap just there. Otherwise, a solid unbroken line like that's not going to, I don't think it's going to do much for the painting. We need to get in somewhere, get through there somehow. Yeah, what I'm going to show you is this. If you use those colors, the blue and the raw sienna somewhere, and in a, you know, whereas I was going up and down making those sort of marks, if you just cover a section like that in very wet, with very wet but rich paint, okay, it's got to be very wet, it's got to be a lot of paint. Even put a little bit of the yellow in there if you wanted to, and then in there, because that looks better anyway, because you've got a dark area, and whilst the rest of that stretch is mostly light, so you do need to break up the tonal values as you travel down here. Maybe one more dark area down there like that. But my other trick was going to be this. You take a credit card and you just you press it down like that, and it gives you a texture. Okay, or you scrape, of course, and it gives you another texture. You could go to the base of that dark area of the hedgerow and just scrape a little light area out, as though there are stones or a bit of exposed soil at the base of that hedgerow. Whatever it is you're doing, it just makes for a slightly more interesting hedgerow. Okay, don't do too much of that. You know, there's always that danger that you'll think, oh, I've done it again. You know, I found something I enjoyed doing, and I absolutely did too much of it. So let's take another little breather for a moment. And I think what we'll tackle next is everything that's not a building, okay? So we'll go around these shapes. That's pretty easy to do. We'll go back to the yellow. Here's what I've got. This is the original yellow that I used for that foreground, but I'll just green it up a little bit by the introduction of some blue. Using both of those blues, there's ultramarine blue and cobalt blue together. It doesn't really matter. So I'm just cooling off that yellow a little bit for these trees. I shouldn't use this small brush for this. I should just, I should have the small brush to hand, but I'll go to my round brush, load up my round brush and put in these areas. So going sort of carefully around your buildings and in between your buildings. This. Now this is going to look very cut out and stuck on for the first couple of minutes before we get back to it. Could go over those lifted out areas, but do make good the edges around your building for now, okay? And where else? Greens could just pop up there slightly, around there. Greens here. I'm just obliterating it now, just covering it completely. Okay. If there's any whites, little bits of white that you think are not working, then give them this yellow wash. Now then, I said the little smaller brush would come in handy at this stage. Now we've got to tame those trees back, and almost anything will do the job. But again, I'm just using this sort of bluey gray mix. I'll show you. It's basically the ultramarine blue and raw sienna at the edge of my palette. And, you know, there'll be shadowed central areas of these trees. There'll be areas that are not quite so bright. So another reload of the brush. And if you have to you know, work by rules, then the rule for this, I would say, probably is just make sure that the outer edge is still bright yellow. Okay, the smaller percentage of the shape is being hit by light. So a lot of that inner section is mostly a slightly darker green, like this grayed down green. Just glimmers of sun hitting areas of that area. Now, when I stand back then, as I did then, the first thing that looks really artificial is the edge. Okay, so there's a couple of things you can do here to make these look more natural. You can scrub with the belly of the brush like this, okay, or as I often do, I tend to use my thumb or a finger. Thumb's the best, I think, and just soften the edges. And those shapes that we just painted should look a lot more natural for it. Okay. You know, even I think, and I'm thinking it right now, in fact, we probably need to go even darker. That the lights on those trees now are still, I think there's still too much light in those. So let's do that. Need a bit more blue. And not too much of the raw sienna, but we'll take a bit. And let's darken, because after all, you know, we know that the best effects for popping our focal point are to create lights and darks. And look how that building in particular pops out as soon as we put the darks near it. Let's have a dark green shrub just at the corner of that building there. Otherwise, it looks a little bit contrived if we don't put things in front of the house. But that helps that pop out much better now. Seems as though the darker you go, the better it looks. Okay. And that's because of that's all to do with tone. That is, the tones weren't looking correct for the neighboring areas to the buildings, to our show off pieces. Okay, let's put something on the water. Hi, that brings us to the end of part 2. Thanks for sticking with me on this. The third and final part will be available next week. So if you want immediate notification as to when that becomes available, please remember to subscribe and hit the bell icon, which will make sure that you receive notification. Happy painting. See you at the next one.